Imagine standing on a rocky Mediterranean cliff in the year 1300 BCE. Below you lies a wooden vessel, barely 70 feet long. It is carved from cedar, stitched together with ropes, and powered by a single square sail. Inside its hold rests an impossible treasure: 10 tons of copper from Cyprus, a ton of tin from the distant mountains of Afghanistan, cobalt blue glass from Egypt, elephant tusks from Africa, and royal seals from Babylon. This single ship was a floating global economy. If it sank, kings across 3 continents would go bankrupt, empires would stall. Bronze, the very engine of civilization, could no longer be forged. And who was responsible for guiding this unimaginable wealth across thousands of miles of violent, uncharted water? A crew of fewer than 15 men. They had no compasses, they had no paper maps, they had no radios, no GPS, and no guarantee that the horizon in front of them led to land or to death. Yet, every year, thousands of these men pushed off from the shore, plunging into an abyss that every religion on earth claimed was inhabited by gods and monsters. For thousands of years, history recorded the names of kings, pharaohs, and generals. But the kings did not build the world. The generals did not link the continents. It was the sailors. They were the most vital workforce in human history. Yet today, their story is almost entirely forgotten. How did terrified early humans turn the ocean from an impassable wall into a global highway? How did illiterate navigators cross thousands of miles of open Pacific, using only the feel of ocean swells against their knees? And why did the very men who built the modern world live as outcasts, slaves, and forgotten ghosts? To understand how our globalized world was born, we have to look back at the moment humanity first dared to leave the safety of the dirt. For centuries, historians suffered from a profound misunderstanding. They believed that ancient civilizations grew up in isolation. They assumed that Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and ancient China developed separately, separated by untamed wilderness and terrifying oceans. The land, after all, was dangerous enough. Mountains were impassable, deserts were lethal, armies marched barely 15 miles a day. So how is it that an ancient Egyptian priest in 1500 BCE was buried with lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, amber from the Baltic Sea, and frankincense from the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula? The answer lay buried beneath the sea floor. When marine archaeologists in the late 20th century began discovering ancient shipwrecks, they didn't just find wood and nails, they found proof of a complex, hyper-connected world that wasn't supposed to exist. A single merchant ship at the bottom of the Aegean Sea contained trade goods from at least 9 distinct cultures. Someone had to haul those goods across hundreds of leagues of unpredictable sea. Yet when you read the monumental inscriptions of ancient empires, the sailors are virtually invisible. Rulers boasted of their palaces, their grain harvests, and their slaughter of enemies. They rarely mentioned the desperate, sun-blistered men who made their wealth possible. Why did ancient empires hide their seafarers? The real reason was far stranger than mere arrogance. In the ancient mind, the ocean was not a place of glory. It was a realm of chaos, punishment, and lawlessness. To be a sailor was to live on the edge of human sanity, a profession so dangerous that many cultures viewed mariners not as pioneers, but as doomed men who had already traded their souls to the sea. And yet, despite the horror, they kept sailing. Long before iron nails, long before sails, human beings looked out at the water and saw an opportunity. It began quietly. A hollowed-out tree trunk along the rivers of Eurasia, a bundle of woven reeds along the Nile. Early humans used these primitive craft for fishing, staying close enough to shore to touch the bottom with a long pole. Then came a quiet revolution that altered human destiny forever: the invention of the sail. No one knows the name of the first person who tied a woven reed mat to a wooden pole and caught the wind, but when that moment occurred, humanity unlocked the first non-animal source of energy in history. For the first time, humans could move heavy weight across vast distances without using muscle power. The earliest true sailors emerged in 2 wildly different corners of the ancient world: the Mediterranean Sea and the Indo-Pacific. In the Mediterranean, early mariners practiced cabotage, hugging the coastline from one visible landmark to another. They sailed by day and pulled their boats onto sandy beaches by night. If a storm blew in, they hid in natural harbors. It was cautious, it was slow, but it laid the foundation for maritime trade. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in the vast waters of the Pacific Ocean, a completely different group of mariners was attempting something that modern scientists still consider almost unbelievable: Around 1500 BCE, the ancestors of the Polynesians set out from the islands of Southeast Asia into the open Pacific, the largest body of water on Earth. They did not have metal tools. They had no written language. Their vessels were double-hulled canoes, held together by coconut fiber cordage. Unlike the Mediterranean sailors who feared losing sight of the shore, Polynesian navigators intentionally sailed into the trackless blue ocean. How did they survive? They developed a system of environmental readings so complex that it borders on the miraculous. A master navigator, or wayfinder, did not use instruments. He memorized the rise and set points of over 100 stars. He read the flight paths of migratory birds. He could tell how far away an island was simply by watching the color of the underside of clouds, which reflected the green tint of shallow lagoons miles away. Most remarkably, Polynesian navigators could read the deep ocean swells. By resting their bodies against the hull of the canoe, they could feel the subtle intersection of waves bouncing off distant unseen islands. They could detect land over 70 miles away without ever seeing it. These men expanded human civilization across 1/3 of the planet's surface. While Western civilizations were still terrified of leaving the coast, Pacific sailors had successfully colonized tiny specks of land scattered across millions of square miles of empty ocean, from New Zealand to Hawaii to Easter Island. Yet back in the Old World, a different kind of sailor was about to turn the sea into an economic engine of conquest and wealth. By 1000 BCE, the Mediterranean had become the economic center of the ancient world, and one nation ruled its trade routes, the Phoenicians. Operating from a narrow strip of land in modern-day Lebanon, the Phoenicians were squeezed between mountains and hostile land empires. To survive, they had no choice. They had to turn to the sea. Phoenician sailors were the ultimate master builders of antiquity. They designed round-hulled cargo vessels called goliai that could carry heavy loads, and sleek, double-banked warships designed to ram enemy vessels. More importantly, Phoenician mariners did something no Mediterranean sailors had dared before. They stopped hugging the shore. They learned to navigate by the pole star, which ancient Greeks called the Phoenician star. They sailed straight across open water, night and day, establishing trade colonies across the Mediterranean, including the legendary city of Carthage. Phoenician sailors pushed past the Straits of Gibraltar, the terrifying Pillars of Hercules, and ventured into the cold, churning waters of the Atlantic Ocean. They sailed north to Britain to harvest tin, and south along the west coast of Africa. According to the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, a fleet of Phoenician sailors accomplished an extraordinary feat around 600 BCE. Commissioned by an Egyptian pharaoh, they spent 3 years circumnavigating the entire continent of Africa, returning to Egypt through the Mediterranean. Herodotus himself doubted the story. He wrote that the sailors claimed something completely ridiculous. As they sailed around the southern tip of Africa, the sun appeared on their right side, to the north. To Herodotus, this sounded impossible. But to modern historians, that single detail proves the story was true. They had crossed the equator. As centuries passed, maritime technology exploded. The Romans built massive grain fleets that fed a population of over 1 million citizens. Their merchant ships were colossal, some reaching over 1,000 tons in displacement, sizes that would not be seen again in Europe for over a millennium. In Asia, the Song dynasty of China revolutionized seafaring by inventing the stern-mounted rudder and, crucially, the magnetic compass. Chinese mariners built massive wooden multi-deck junks featuring watertight compartments, a safety feature Europe wouldn't adopt for another 800 years. By the Middle Ages, sailors were no longer just transport workers. They were the absolute lifelines of global power. If a nation possessed skilled sailors, it dominated trade, accumulated gold, and built empires. If its sailors failed, the nation starved. Yet, despite their growing importance, the daily life of a sailor was deteriorating into a living nightmare. By the 15th century, humanity reached a critical turning point. The old overland trade routes connecting Europe to Asia, the famous Silk Road, were cut off or heavily taxed by rival empires. Europe was desperate. Gold, spices, and silk were flowing out of reach. The only option left was the sea. This launched the Age of Discovery, an era celebrated in history books as a heroic age of exploration. But for the men who actually pulled the ropes and set the sails, it was an era of unprecedented horror. When Portuguese and Spanish caravels set sail into the Atlantic, pushing past the equator into unknown oceans, they faced a new and terrifying enemy. It wasn't sea monsters, it wasn't naval battles, it was an invisible killer that decayed the body from the inside out. Within weeks at sea, sailors' gums would swell and bleed. Their teeth would fall out. Old wounds healed decades prior would miraculously burst open again. Their joints would swell, their skin would turn black with bruised blood, and lethargy would slip into insanity and death. The disease was scurvy. For nearly 300 years, scurvy killed more sailors than storms, shipwrecks, naval battles, and all other diseases combined. Historians estimate that between the years 1500 and 1800, scurvy slaughtered over 2 million mariners. It was so lethal that ship captains routinely brought twice as many crew members as necessary, fully expecting half of them to rot and die before reaching their destination. During Ferdinand Magellan's famous expedition to circumnavigate the globe in 1519, over 230 men set sail. Only 18 returned alive. Most were destroyed not by native weapons or drowning, but by starvation and scurvy. Yet, despite this horrific death toll, European rulers kept pushing sailors deeper into the unknown. Why? Because the economic rewards were staggering. A single cargo of nutmeg or cloves brought back from the East Indies could make a ship captain rich for life and fund an entire national treasury. To kings and merchant corporations, sailors were an infinitely expendable resource. When voluntary recruits dried up, nations turned to state-sanctioned violence. In Great Britain, the government created press gangs. Armed squads roamed coastal towns, hunting down men in taverns, dragging them out of their beds, or beating them unconscious on the streets. They were shoved onto warships and forced into naval service for years at a time, locked below deck to prevent them from swimming ashore. Life aboard an 18th-century sailing vessel was brutal. Rations consisted of rock-hard biscuit infested with weevils, salted meat so preserved it resembled hard leather, and stagnant water stored in slimy wooden barrels. Discipline was enforced through sheer terror. A tiny infraction could result in dozens of lashes with a cat o' nine tails, a whip made of knotted rope that tore the skin off a man's back. For mutiny, the punishment was swift. Hanging from the yardarm or being keel-hauled, dragged by ropes underneath the sharp, barnacle-encrusted bottom of the ship, shredding the sailor's flesh before he drowned. Yet, out of this misery came the ultimate breakthrough that finally bound the world together. For centuries, sailors faced a lethal mathematical problem. They could easily determine their latitude, their north-south position, by measuring the angle of the sun or the North Star above the horizon, using an astrolabe or quadrant. But calculating longitude, their east-west position, was impossible on a moving ship. To calculate longitude, you need to compare local solar time on your ship with the precise time at a fixed reference point, like Greenwich, England. Every hour of difference equals 15 degrees of longitude. The problem? In the 17th and 18th centuries, clocks used pendulums. On a rolling, pitching ocean ship, a pendulum clock stopped working instantly. Without longitude, captains sailed blind across the east-west axis. They were forced to use a dangerous method called parallel sailing, sailing to the correct latitude and then riding that latitude line east or west until they slammed into land. If their calculations were off by even a tiny fraction, ships crashed onto jagged reefs in the dead of night. In 1707, a disaster shocked the world. A British naval fleet under Admiral Sir Cloudesley Shovel was returning home through foggy weather. Believing they were safe in the open ocean, the navigators misjudged their longitude. 4 massive warships slammed directly into the Scilly Isles off the coast of England. Nearly 2,000 sailors died in a matter of hours. The British Parliament panicked. They passed the Longitude Act of 1714, offering a life-changing prize of £20,000, the modern equivalent of millions of dollars, to anyone who could solve the longitude problem. Great scientists like Isaac Newton believed the answer lay in complex astronomical charts. Instead, the solution came from an uneducated carpenter's son named John Harrison. Harrison spent decades crafting an exquisite, frictionless mechanical clock that could keep ticking accurately, despite the rocking motion, temperature shifts, and humidity of an ocean voyage. His creation, the H4 marine chronometer, was tested on a sea voyage to Jamaica. After 81 days at sea, the clock had lost only 5 seconds. Harrison had given sailors the ultimate gift, a map of time. Now, mariners could pinpoint their exact location anywhere on Earth. The oceans were officially conquered. Yet inside this triumphant historical leap lay forgotten, personal human stories that never made it into standard history books. Consider the story of Galvarino, a Mapuche warrior forced to serve as a coastal mariner, or the countless enslaved African navigators whose brilliant knowledge of coastal currents was used by European slave ships, yet whose names were erased from logbooks. Or consider the tattooed sailors. When Captain James Cook returned from his Pacific voyages in the late 1700s, his crew brought back a Polynesian art form called tatau. European mariners adopted the practice, turning their bodies into living logs of their sea journeys. A swallow tattoo meant a sailor had logged 5,000 nautical miles. A turtle meant he had crossed the equator. A dragon meant he had served in the China Seas. Tattoos were not just decoration, they were a sailor's identity, and often his only dental or medical record. If a ship disintegrated on the rocks, washed-up bodies could only be identified by the ink carved into their skin. Sailors created their own isolated subculture. They developed their own language, a dialect of nautical jargon that still shapes the English language today. When you say you are taken aback, you are using a 18th century sailing phrase describing wind suddenly hitting the front of a sail, pushing a ship backward. When you say overwhelmed, you are using an old nautical term for a boat rolling over in rough seas. Even phrases like 3 sheets to the wind, slush fund, clean bill of health, and learning the ropes were invented by sailors living in the cramped, salt-soaked wooden worlds of the high seas. They were a class of men cut off from society, bound to one another by shared suffering, shared language, and shared mortality. And just as their subculture reached its peak, a new invention arrived that rendered their centuries-old skills completely obsolete. In the mid-19th century, a strange sound echoed across the world's ports. It was not the creak of timber or the flap of heavy canvas. It was the rhythmic, mechanical thud of a steam engine and the hiss of pressure valves. The arrival of steam-powered, iron-hulled ships changed everything. For thousands of years, a sailor's value lay in his physical mastery of wind and rigging. A master mariner could read the clouds, splice heavy rope, climb 80 feet into a freezing gale to furl canvas, and feel the sea's temperament through the helm. Virtually overnight, those ancient skills were replaced by coal shovels, gauges, and engines. The romantic, terrifying era of the sailing ship vanished into history. Yet, if you look closely at our modern world, the legacy of those ancient sailors is everywhere around us. Every container ship cutting through the waves today follows the exact trade routes charted millennia ago by Phoenician oarsmen, Polynesian wayfinders, and Portuguese caravels. When you order a product from across the planet and it arrives at your doorstep a few days later, you are participating in a seamless global trade network built on the blood, sweat, and lives of mariners who sailed into the black unknown without maps or guarantees. They were men who lived in the shadows of society, abused by kings, tormented by disease, and forgotten by history books. Yet they were the true architects of our planet. They turned the oceans from terrifying barriers into bridges. They connected isolated continents into a single, living human family. The next time you look out at the ocean, don't just see empty water. See the invisible highway paved by millions of nameless sailors, the men who dared to leave the shore so that the world could finally meet.